Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, I am Austin Carter. I'm a co-owner at Pocket Bookshop, a queer feminist bookstore in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I am so excited to be here chatting with Dr. Nussaibah Younis, who is the author of the wonderful book Fundamentally, which definitely deserves a place on your shelves if you are also a bookstore owner. And if you're just a reader, then you need to be reading it, because this is one of my favorite books that I've read in the last several months. So I'll just read a little bio quickly of Dr. Younis, and then we'll go from there. So, well, I guess we'll call you Nussaibah. Is that what you prefer for this purpose?
To me.
Perfect. So Nussaibah is a peace-building practitioner and a globally recognized expert on contemporary Iraq. She has a PhD in International Affairs from Durham University in the UK and a BA in Modern History and English from the University of Oxford. Dr. Younis was a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., where she directed the Future of Iraq Task Force and offered strategic advice to the U.S. government agencies on Iraq policy. Dr. Younis has published op-eds in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian, and has provided on-air commentary for the BBC and Al Jazeera. So I am very out of my depth here, but that's okay. She's also the author of the fabulous debut novel, Fundamentally. So before we kind of jump into questions, do you maybe want to just give your elevator pitch for what Fundamentally is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, I just want to thank you, Austin. You've been so supportive of the book, and I really appreciate it. You've been already such a massive champion. So thank you for reading it and for getting so on board. I was actually really worried about whether or not the book would connect in the US. So this has been just such an amazing start. So Fundamentally is a dark comedy. It's about a heartbroken academic called Nadia who decides to cope with her breakup by accepting a job with the UN in Baghdad. It's actually a great way to get over a breakup. I can definitely recommend it. So when she gets to Iraq, she's tasked with creating a program to de-radicalize ISIS brides. And that is not something Nadia knows how to do. So, there commences a nightmare of bureaucracy and corruption and colleagues who despise her. And just as she's about to give up and go back to London with her tail between her legs, she visits the refugee camp and meets Sarah, a young ISIS bride who joined when she was just 15. And Sarah is bold and funny and witty and precocious, and she has a strong East London accent. And Nadia and Sarah really connect. It's electricity. They have such good banter. And, Sarah just really reminds Nadia of a younger version of herself. And that connection really fuels Nadia to actually try and make that job work. She wants to save Sarah, though it's not clear whether Sarah wants to be saved.
Absolutely. So what Nussaibah is underplaying here is just how incredibly funny this book is. As you read it, you are going to be in hysterics. I particularly love this book. I'm also a former academic, not a heartbroken academic necessarily, but all of the bits in the beginning where Nadia's just waiting for some colleagues to die so that she can get a job. I was like, I really understand this. I was doing that and they didn't die fast enough, so I opened a bookstore instead.
Struggle is real.
Struggle is real. I'm very much. You don't want to relate to Nadia quite as much as I did, which you probably can agree with.
That's the trick. You
That's
can't hate her because she is you.
that is the real problem. I know. So I feel like the all of the books that I love the most, and probably you love the most, are the ones that get the reviews that say, I didn't really like the main character. And I'm like, well, that was your mistake because you are her. She is all of us.
I love a flawed heroine.
Yeah, flawed is understatement and correct. I just loved her. I love Nadia. Okay, perfect. Let's dive into some questions. So, in Fundamentally, you offer a brilliant, if I do say so, satire of people who take very seriously the business of solving the world's problems. So, be they academics with unified theories of feminist resistance to colonial oppression, or humanitarian bureaucrats hell bent on securing funding to draft committees to plan programs that will definitely probably help people maybe and eventually. And in real life, you have occupied both of those worlds. I did some light stalking on your website. You call yourself a former do-gooder with experience in academia, think tanks, and peace building in the Middle East. So, can you talk a little bit about what drove you to take aim, so to speak, and write this particular book?
Yeah. So the book is really inspired by actually both my professional and my personal life. Um, I'm just such a bleeding heart empath, and I grew up watching, the wars in Chechnya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq on TV, and was just absolutely desperate to sort of do something to help people. And I ended up forging a career in peace building, ended up working in Iraq. Um, and I was asked at some point to help design a program to de-radicalize ISIS brides in Iraq. And when I went to a refugee camp and met, my first ever ISIS brides, I just had this sort of shocking realization how easily I could have ended up on the other side. I grew up very religious, and I attended a summer camp one year when I was 17, with a preacher, an American Yemeni preacher called Sheikh Anwar al-Awlaki. And I really liked him. He was so funny and he was charming and he was really compelling,
Mhm.
when he talked about our duty to sort of help defend people. And it really tugged at my heartstrings. Um, and a couple of years later, he joined Al Qaeda. And that was just an astonishing turn of events. It just hadn't occurred to me. But I realized that had he done it that summer, had he tried to radicalize me, I just wonder what would have happened. And
Mhm.
again, it would have been born out of that same impulse of wanting to go to the Middle East to help people who were suffering. But if someone had persuaded me that that was the correct route when I was young and impressionable and didn't know any better, I just wonder what would have happened. And so I wanted to write a novel in which I could explore that sliding doors moment and look at those two different versions of myself, me sort of as I did turn out, working, with international NGOs in peace building, backed by by the US government and other Western governments. But also what would happen if that version of me confronted a younger version of me who'd taken another path, and who
Mhm.
thought she'd done the right thing by joining ISIS, also to defend people and to help people who were suffering in that part of the world. And what would happen if those two versions of myself confronted one another, both thinking that they'd done the right thing? And I thought that would just be such a fabulous kind of premise for a novel and so fascinating, but also with endless opportunity for humor. Because can you imagine having a conversation with your 15-year-old self? They would be so annoying.
Exactly. And remembering you have so much compassion for Sarah, and just remembering how much you make your decisions based on terrible things, like just who you think is funny or charming, or what your friends are doing. Like she mentioned just that, oh, my friends did this and it seemed not that bad.
Yeah, oh my God. And there's just this moral certitude that teenagers often have where she so believes that she's done the right thing. And it's actually really difficult to argue with her because she has this very black and white perspective on the world. And, what do you tell someone, when you're challenged, how are you helping? It's so difficult to answer that question. And, I thought it was so relatable as well to think about your 15-year-old self looking at your life as it's turned out and being disappointed and thinking, well, you could have done better. You should have done more. You're not helping enough. And
No.
it's difficult questions to answer.
Exactly, because that's the space that Nadia's in already. I feel like she's already sitting there thinking, wait, should I have done better? Should I have done something else? Am I doing the best that I can? And so to meet up with the externalized version of that is stressful, to say the least. But I feel like that's so much of what the novel is about. I think you do such an interesting job of exploring on so many different levels the kind of chasm between what we think we understand the world to be or ourselves to be versus what we actually maybe experience or see in the real world. So Nadia has a PhD in criminology. She's got a relatively hastily researched and written article proposing a program to de-radicalize ISIS brides. And then all of a sudden she has UN funding to do exactly that. But when she arrives in Iraq, she realizes just how little all of her academic and critical understanding of this situation has prepared her to actually be there and do the things she says she's qualified to do. The opening bits of the novel, skipping the prologue to make my point, but the opening bit of chapter 1 is Nadia arriving in Baghdad and she's just shocked to see fairy lights and Audis and teens practicing TikTok dances. So I'll just quote a minute. She says, "Why was it so nice?" She wonders. What happened to the rolling blackouts, the electrical transmission network supposedly ravaged by war? Hadn't I donated to help the Iraqi women giving birth in cowsheds lit by the flame of a single candle? So, how do you flip Nadia's expectations on their heads throughout the novel? And you do this in so many ways with so many different characters. And what is that gap between what she thinks she knows and what she actually experiences allow you to do as an author in the novel?
Yeah, I thought it was so fun to just satirize foreigners who show up in a war zone or in a developing country who think that they are going to be saviors. Like it's actually it's such a hubristic attitude and definitely one that I have had. Um, and have been humiliated, for having had it. But the idea that you show up in a place and think that you know better, that you have something to offer that locals don't have actually tenfold more. And so I love the idea of having Nadia show up and be totally shocked that Baghdad is actually quite nice and that locals are driving much better cars than her. Well, she can't even afford a car. And there's a scene in the novel where Nadia meets the Minister of Humane Affairs for the first time. And Nadia is wearing, some hideously cheap suit because she thinks, well, she's humanitarian, why would clothes matter? And of course, the minister has immediately no respect for her because the minister's wearing designer clothes from head to toe and is demanding trips to luxury hotels on the Mediterranean in order to give Nadia a sign off for her program. And she's suddenly thrust into this world where actually she's dealing with a global elite because she's with the UN and she's dealing with government ministers. And this isn't actually a poor country. That's just her prejudice and her ignorance, really. And so everything's been turned on its head once she actually arrives and she's very much put in her place. So yeah, I thought it was quite a fun way to satirize kind of the broader approach and some of the expectations that exist in the humanitarian world.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's that kind of double twist for your how should I say, well-intentioned white readers, perhaps, who will look at Nadia and be like, wait, but how are you confused? Because aren't you the same? Wait, what? And that's like that extra subtle twist of the knife that you're doing that it doesn't get commented on, but it's there, and I'm very excited to see how people respond.
Yeah, I've talked a lot with my publishers about the notion of a brown savior. Nadia thinks that she can't be prejudiced because she's not white, but actually she definitely can be.
She's like, I can't, I'm not doing anything problematic. I can't. Not really. Okay. So early in the novel, Nadia is enraptured, as you say, by this young girl in the camp named Sarah, who is also hysterical. I loved Sarah every moment that she is on the page or on screen, so to speak. And so Nadia very quickly makes Sarah her entire focus. Perhaps like maybe in a good way, maybe not. Despite the girl's seeming disinterest in being saved, Nadia is completely in over her head, and unaware, or at least very, very good at ignoring the ironies of her attempts to help others in order to help herself. And so, fundamentally, in general, is a novel interested in the conflicting forces of self-interest and the desire to help others. So now I'm just asking big philosophical questions here, but so like, is selfishness mutually exclusive with selflessness? Softball version, what is fundamentally trying to say about what it means to really want to help? So we're talking about white saviors and brown saviors and this like desire to be a do-gooder. Like what is the novel trying to get at?
Yeah, so fundamentally, really wants to explore what's beneath that surface level expression. I just want to help people. And it explores that not just through Nadia, who's really there to escape her feelings about her heartbreak and also her really difficult relationship with her mother, but it also explores that same question through just a whole cast of really fun characters. So you have Pierre, who's a French Nepo baby. His father and his grandfather were French ambassadors to the US. And Pierre, who's only working at the UN, is a great disappointment to the family by comparison. And so, Pierre is there because it's the family business to be in international diplomacy and is actually, hugely defensive because in his family context, he's considered to be someone who hasn't succeeded. And it's sort of constantly trying to prove himself, but is also, very grumpy about not having had, real control over his decision, over his career. And you have, and Pierre has this bromance with his best friend, Charles, who is from a very high-powered political family in South Africa. His dad used to be an advisor to Nelson Mandela. And Charles was this like wonderkind, PhD at 19, married at 22, got 3 kids, and then just realized in his late 20s that he'd just never been young. And so actually for Charles, moving to Iraq to join the UN is a holiday. And you'd be surprised how many people you meet in sorts of international aid who are just running away from their families. If you've sort of ended up with a wife and kids, and you regret that, actually moving, to a war zone or to a developing country, and living on a compound with lots of people you can sleep around with and you can drink heavily, and it's a very intense environment. It can be very fun, definitely gets you away from your home life. So there's people who are, sort of there for those reasons. And even for Cherie, who's this real classic bleeding heart white liberal, feminist, environmentalist, cares a lot about climate change. She too is actually just trying to pay reparations, as it were, for her father, who is an oil man.
Mhm.
So it's just this huge, oversized reaction to the family she grew up in. So that's one of the things I really enjoyed with writing the book, was there's so much opportunity with all the fun characters on the UN base to explore how they'd ended up in this world and what sort of individual motivations they really had, apart from, solely trying to help, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, and the opportunity for humor in each of those characters is just endless. It's an endless gold mine. We didn't even mention Tom, who is
Oh,
the
Tom.
funniest. Tom is this like himbo. We meet him right away. He unironically is just quoting Lawrence of Arabia all of the
I know someone who does that.
Oh, I assumed. I was like, this detail is too on the nose. She must have met this guy in real life. There's no way she came up with this. It would be obscene if it didn't actually happen. I know. So the satire is outrageous. It's so funny. Are you nervous at all that people are not going to get it? And by that I mean, are you ready for the people to want to complain in reviews about like, well, but these are actually serious issues, so I don't know that we need to be making fun of people who want to help.
I've been really lucky to have lots of early readers. And the feedback has just been overwhelming in how much people have enjoyed the humor. And
Good.
when I started working on this topic, a lot of people told me, because I have a PhD, that the obvious choice was to write a non-fiction book about, the question of ISIS brides or whatever. And I thought, my God, what a chore that book would be to read.
Nobody wants to read that.
Even if you bought it, it would be because you felt like you had to, and you would put it on the shelf and think, oh, maybe one day. And I just thought, this world that I'm describing is not a boring world to exist in, to experience. It's funny, it's wild, it's so fascinating, it's completely emotional. It gets at every single facet of like the human experience. And so I felt like I wanted to write a novel that was just a joy to read, and that it was difficult to put down, rather than having something that felt like a task that you sort of had to complete, or like homework. So yeah.
Yeah, we say that all the time. We're like, books shouldn't be eating your greens. This shouldn't be a thing you're forcing yourself to do because you think it makes you a better person. The books are there because you can learn through them in the most enjoyable way, and that's okay. As you're talking, I'm thinking how this this like very like serious kind of academic like very like focused world, this ends up being the mirror opposite of a novel. Like if there were a true novel about Hollywood or being a celebrity, all of that would just be sitting around waiting and getting your makeup done and doing nothing but paperwork. And so it's not nearly as glamorous as you think, whereas this UN novel is just them going to clubs and sleeping around.
I know, it's because the industry sort of has to project this sense of being very serious.
Yeah.
And so all of the fun stuff goes a little bit below the radar. And also, I'd read so little that really showed what it's like to work in like international NGOs and in the UN.
Yeah.
And it's such a hidden world, and it's so fascinating and such a great lens into big political issues, but without doing it in a laborious way.
Yeah, no, it had never occurred. I was like, of course, all of the people for the UN are living in these college campuses, basically, these little compounds. Like, of course, that's what they're doing. That has just never occurred to me. And of course, they're wilding out while they're there. It's so good. Okay, I think we're running short on time, but I do have one more. Obviously, long question because it's the only way I know how to do things. But there's so much more to discuss in the novel. I really want to talk. I wish we had time to talk about Nadia and her mom, which is just such a beautiful, compelling, complex relationship. That's the undercurrent of the novel, and I just like cry thinking about it. I loved it, but I don't have time for that, so I'm skipping over it. Instead, we're going to go back to the very beginning and talk about the novel's title, Fundamentally. So obviously the title is referring most obviously to Islamic fundamentalism. Nadia refers to Sarah and the other ISIS brides as fundies. They refer to each other as fundies, with religious extremism figured as a kind of dangerous ideology. But actually, if you look even a little bit closely at the novel, you'll see that all ideology is kind of suspect. So you have each of these characters who they all believe in things very, very strongly, or at least they want to profess that they believe in things very strongly. Cherie, who we touched on her briefly, but she is hysterical. She is devoted to, if not the practice, the language of social justice and environmentalism and feminism and all of that. Rosie, who's Nadia's ex girlfriend, she has these deceptively restrictive rules of how you actually can be queer, and that there's maybe actually only one good way of doing it. Nadia's mom has these kind of confusingly conservative, but then not always, mores. And the novel's just like very sympathetic to people's seemingly fundamental, I did it on purpose, desire for rules and guidance. So I'm thinking about how Nadia has kind of just bounced from like a kind of strict devotion to Islam when she's very young, and then following Rosie's rules of, okay, if you're not doing that, instead, here's how to be a cool, like, queer radical person. And then she's following all of the mind-numbing rules of academia, which are legion and nonsensical. And her current kind of grasping for guidance and meaning, which she's like, maybe I'm doing by getting prestige, and then actually maybe I'm doing by helping someone, question mark. So what are you hoping that readers take away from your novel when it comes to belief, kind of broadly writ?
I think belief in the novel is really a function of your very messy home life and upbringing.
Yeah, we're in the political is personal, the personal is political. We're just like, we're back in it.
I think the novel is just very empathetic. It shows a lot of different people who think that they believe different things very strongly and who commit to different lifestyles very strongly. But you start to see how much sort of messiness there is underneath it, and how much it relates to a desire for belonging, a desire for meaning. And often when people behave and think in the most extreme ways, it's a reflection of a real like loss of connection with a birth family or with a community of origin. And that's why actually the emotional undercurrent of the book is really about both Nadia and Sarah's loss of real supportive relationships with their families. And it tries to, I think the book really tries to say that the ideology itself isn't the thing that matters. It's why people have chosen to attach themselves to one or another and what really lays behind that. And yeah, so that's really what I'm trying. And it's not, it was important to me that the book in no way be didactic, and it doesn't tell you what you should believe, and it doesn't tell you what you should think or how you should judge each of these characters. They're all deserving of judgment in some way or another.
And of empathy.
Yeah, but they're all so human.
Yeah.
And I think the messiness is something that we can all relate to and see ourselves in.
No, that's exactly like I feel like every really truly good novel, when you break it all the way down, is just about how hard it is to be a person. Like, it's the hardest thing there is. And you've nailed it. You did it.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, I am so excited for Fundamentally to hit shelves on February 25th. It also has the most stunning cover. It's going to look so good. I'm so, so excited. And yeah, I thank you so much for chatting with me. Thank you for writing this book. And I can't wait to see what you're working on next.
Thank you so much, Austin. It was great to properly chat to you.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!